to our final session. Thanks for hanging with us through the day. I know it's been a long one, but also an extraordinarily enlightening one. This final panel looks to the open questions to inform the work of the new working group. We're joined by Arunabha Ghosh of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in Delhi, Steve Gardner from University of Washington, Josh Horton from Harvard University, Neil Craik from the University of Waterloo, and Oliver Morton from The Economist. We're going to move down the panel in the order in which they're sitting. And we have about 12 minutes per presentation, leaving about 20, 30 minutes on the back end for conversation.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon to you all. I've been sitting there and making trouble all day, so it's now my chance to, formally make trouble. But I had a different title, a more academic title to my presentation, which had something to do with the Paris Agreement and climate engineering, etc. And then as I sat through the day listening to all the presentations, I thought everything has already been said. So, the best I can do is maybe, ask some tough questions and give some homework for the working group. That's going to meet again tomorrow. It was introduced earlier. I represent the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We're one of South Asia's leading policy research institutions. But among other things, I've been thinking about, at least, and writing from time to time about climate engineering governance since about 2010. And I was co-chair of the International Governance Working Group of SRMGI. And it's about 3 in the morning in India right now, and Andy Parker knows that when it's 3 in the morning and I'm awake, I'm doing, I'm up to no good. So I will try to maintain that reputation. Here's the thing. Let's start with the good news. I call the Paris Agreement a capstone and a stepping stone. Capstone, for obvious reasons, more than 2 decades of effort, brings us to a stage where all countries agree to act on climate change in one way or the other. But the interesting part about this is it's a stepping stone for a new type of global collaborative climate action. The first part of that is that we have to get very, very ambitious about where we want to go. And that's where that 1.5 degrees comes in. And many of you have already touched upon it. I will also touch upon it, but in a slightly different way. This is, as you know, the kind of curve we are supposed to be on. But if you add up what the INDC, so just before Paris, what the major economies or the major emitters promised, it basically meant that just about half of the remaining carbon space was left for the rest of the world. So we had an emissions gap of about 15 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent. Post-Paris, we actually we decided as climate negotiators to become even more ambitious. So that red line is kind of representative. It's not really a very scientific line. But what it means is that with the current targets, the major emitters end up capturing pretty much all of the remaining carbon space. Now, I'm not trying to put China, US, EU on the spot here, just highlighting the scale of the problem we've got, which basically means that we've got to focus on negative emissions technologies, and that's where some of the discussions around climate engineering have been coming forward. But we don't really know the pathway that will get us there. Again, these are all just representative curves in a sense. We don't know what is the technological pathway, apart from some sort of imaginary world. Just like Steve Rayner says, we don't have a geoengineering as a technology solution today. It basically means that we are left with a world where we're going to be dealing with a lot of climate change impacts, a lot of need for adaptation, a lot of money being spent on a lot of different things. And that's the kind of spectrum within which we have to think about where climate engineering fits in. Now, in the past, right at the end of the last session, this notion came up about multilateralism and technology partnerships and so forth. So what I had done just before Paris was look at about 30 odd climate-friendly technology partnerships, and try to see whether they do anything much or not. And mostly they end up doing this part of technology partnership, which is knowledge sharing. Basically, as I think someone mentioned, we talk a lot. But very little about actual R&D, very little about hard or soft technology transfer, almost nil deployment mandates, standards, etc. So that's why I said in the morning, I understand your frustrations as scientists. But what changed in Paris is that we broke away a little bit from that past, and some interesting things happened. One, there were a lot of public technology-related partnerships being announced. From the Indian side, the International Solar Alliance being one dimension of it. From the American side, the mission innovation that Andrew was just referring to. And also the role of the private sector coming in very formally in that process with the Bill Gates-driven Breakthrough Energy Coalition initiative. So all of that gives us a flavor that Paris has triggered a thought for us working on how do we get to that 1.5, and given us some templates of new kinds of technology partnerships. But here's where we have a bit of a problem. When we think about climate engineering, and now I'm going to, I think Jane used the term the devil's, you didn't say devil's advocate, you said devil's attorney or something. In describing me, yeah, troublemaker, as I said. That if I were to be the troublemaker as a sort of lay politician or of some sorts, I would say, yeah, but are you considering all technologies, right? Before you're talking about climate engineering. This is just, again, as an example, a colleague of mine was looking at the business as usual scenario for India's electricity mix. And we saw that, well, over the course of the century, coal, nuclear, biomass, et cetera, are important parts. But here's what happens when you try to get into a 2 degrees scenario. Nuclear becomes a big part, along with solar, along with CCS. And then we modeled, what if nuclear were removed from the equation altogether? Then CCS becomes very important, particularly bio-CCS becomes very important. And what if CCS were not commercialized? Then nuclear takes a large share. Now here's the problem. There's no reference to nuclear, for instance, in the Paris Agreement. Now I'm not pro or anti-nuclear, yeah. The simple point is that when we're thinking about this whole trajectory or a spectrum of technologies, we're not being very honest and upfront about everything that has to be tried out. And in that spectrum, thinking about climate engineering. So here's why I think it's not going to be very easy, because I think Paris represented a crucial point, but a fleeting moment when climate scientists, climate technologists, and climate negotiators all came together, in a sense, and got us the agreement. But in general, and as it has been indicated through the day, they are actually inhabiting different planets often, and which are only partially intersecting. You don't need to read this, but these are from some breakout group charts that we wrote up in a meeting I think Steve Rayner was organizing in London about a year and a half ago. And you can see that whether it's marine cloud brightening or BECCS, there are a lot of enabling conditions and a lot of disabling conditions that operate at the global or local level. So it's not just about what the science or the equations say. There will be a number of factors that have to be taken into account. And that's why it's not going to be easy to bring those different worlds together just because we wish them to be. So I'm going to skip over this slide because Dan Budansky has already talked about the various forums that can deal with it, or how we organize international governance programs, particularly issues of intellectual property that were being discussed. We can talk about that later. So let me just use my remaining 2.5 minutes or so to just then pose some difficult questions for the next stage of climate engineering governance. First question is how quickly do we end up in a climate engineering world? That's a book/report that I worked on with Dan Schrag, David King, and others last year. And the meeting that I organized in Delhi was basically a war game. And we brought together generals, admirals, national security folks, diplomats from about 10 countries to work on this. It was interesting that the table that had climate scientists went very quickly into a geoengineering world by about 2025, 2030. Whereas, the generals and the admirals, were like, this is way too dangerous, we are not going to go there. And the diplomats were somewhere in between. So how quickly will we end up in this world, right? And therefore, which is why I was asking this question to Tom Ackerman earlier, what is missing in our communication of explaining why this research is needed? The second big question, thanks. The second big question is who chooses to go ahead and how? Some of you might have heard of this Haida Salmon Restoration Corporation, but why I talk about this is that in 2011, when I gave a keynote to the IPCC, one of the scenarios I outlined was that a small island nation might use its sovereignty to invite scientists from somewhere else and do climate engineering. So climate engineering is not just something that big countries with a lot of resources do. And within a year, that's exactly the scenario that played out. So who chooses to go ahead and how? You can think about different scenarios: purely privately funded research, a small group of large countries, a larger group of countries doing something together, or a small island state simply using its sovereignty. And what would that mean for governance or the experiment? Who do we consult? How do we consult? And for how long? We've talked a lot about stakeholder consultations. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Public information could be simply, you're a project proponent, you're telling the community, this is what we're going to do. Public consultation is the other way around. Community tells you, here's what we think. Public participation is a bi-directional flow of information. Now, last year, on the request of the Prime Minister's office, we analyzed 11,176 projects that had applied for environmental clearances over the past decade in India. And we saw that the delays in getting a clearance were basically concentrated in energy-specific sectors. And the delays were happening because of this public consultations phase, because the regulators were saying, we are not getting enough information of what the public wants or does not want, right? I'm using that as an example of why we need to think about how we consult, who do we consult, and what if they said no, right? Then what's our response? Let me skip over this, it's too complicated for now. And therefore, just in the minute left, well, my time is up, so I'll spend 1 minute to outline the homework for the working group. As I said, Paris, I think, has changed how we think about climate technology development. So there is going to be more demand for participative public-private research. And climate engineers should probably think about this modality. That doesn't necessarily mean it's multilateralized, but you should think about this new world that we've entered. Paris, of course, has implicitly opened up the world of climate engineering, but as I argued earlier, we need to discuss the whole suite of technologies, including CDR. I'm a little puzzled why this meeting is only about SRM. Again, in response to my kind of lay question in the morning, if it is going to take 20 years of modeling, then I think it's going to be unlikely to get clear governance mechanisms now. Climate policymakers are pretty busy with doing some other stuff. But that means that it's even more important to explain why and how climate engineering research is a continuation of climate science and climate technology research, not a separate world out there. And if you can communicate that, I think some of the resistance that the scientists face will change. Stakeholders are no longer just going to be interested academic researchers, at least as I have observed over the last 5 years, people like us coming together every half a year or something like that. So stakeholder engagement is difficult, long, hard, and inconclusive, and get ready for that, right? And therefore, the biggest homework is how do we design how do we develop design inputs for different levels of climate engineering governance? Say, for field testing, how do we engage with communities? For national policy making and legislation, what do we do? For public-private governance, along with independent oversight, what is the design? And finally, will there be plurilateral or multilateral intergovernmental registry, reporting, accountability? So maybe the working group has its work cut out by trying to think of governance mechanisms for these different scenarios playing out. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I should warn you, I'm battling some pretty long-term exhaustion, sleep deprivation at the moment, so if I seem to be incoherent, that's clearly the reason. Okay, so I wanted to introduce something about the ethics and political philosophy of geoengineering as an overview for the panel. Obviously, I only have just over 10 minutes. There's a very sharp limit on what I can say. So I decided rather than getting into the details to give a bit of an overview. So there's a strong emphasis on ethics in the Royal Society report and the National Academy report on its importance for decision making and as a research priority. In what follows, I'm going to assume when it matters that we are talking about stratospheric sulfate injection. One of the reasons that this is important is because what your underlying values are determine what your reasons are for doing geoengineering or possibly not doing geoengineering, and that shapes a lot of the actual arguments in ways that sometimes people don't recognize. But it's also important, even if you've decided that you're going to do geoengineering or you're interested in doing research, that those values still tend to play a role in affecting the design of the kind of geoengineering that you think you should do. So values sort of permeate the debate. Here's a list of salient values from the early literature on climate engineering ethics, if you like. One thing to notice is there are a lot of them, right? Often in the scientific literature, the engineering literature, is a real focus just on welfare, but yet there are also important concerns in the literature of justice, rights, relationship with nature, intention, responsibility, precaution, various things connected with virtue and vice, political legitimacy, control and domination, and so on. And as I say, there's a literature on this. The organizers kindly gave me permission to mention the small gripe that I had when I asked them just to find out what the panel had read, right? So prayer for my presentation on ethics. It turned out, well, not really anything. And the one thing that might have been that was an article by Naomi Klein, right? Which I thought, well, okay, you know, Naomi Klein's a very smart, interesting kind of individual, but it's odd that there's that there's an academic literature on this topic, and Naomi Klein is included. But I do want to emphasize there is literature, and some of it is important to some of the questions that will already come up. Just one small example, Dale Jameson published an article in the 1990s giving a list of what you might call requirements or principles for geoengineering, right, from an ethical kind of point of view, and I think stuff like that is worth discussing. So that's not actually what I'm going to talk about today, though, except to suggest to the panel there is some literature here that's worth considering, not just in geoengineering ethics, actually, but more widely in climate ethics and moral and political philosophy more broadly speaking. Some of these topics we're discussing are just not so new. But I do want to, I thought what I would emphasize here is that some early framings of the geoengineering debate are not helpful when you try to confront these issues, because they tend to obscure or underestimate the ethical concerns, and they include some that have come up already. So one that I really don't like is the sort of two camps framing, are you for it or against it? I tend to think, on the one hand, no one favors geoengineering under just any old circumstance. For instance, there may even be a consensus in this room right now that we shouldn't deploy geoengineering, sulfate injection right now. Perhaps more controversially, but I still think fairly widespread is the view that most people can imagine accepting geoengineering under at least some circumstances, though there's an issue about how unusual and demanding those circumstances might be. They might be equivalent of the Starship Enterprise arriving and Scotty saying he has the plan, right? I mean, it might be so far from where we actually are as to be not so relevant, and that is important. Second kind of framing I think is not so helpful is the kind of every tool in the toolkit kind of idea, right? The idea that we should try everything. First, I think it's misleading because it's just not true that every tool that could be in the toolkit is in the current toolkit. Many things are not being actively considered that would make a dramatic difference, including, lifestyle retrenchment, say, one-child policies, and that sort of thing. And in a way, this framing begs important questions because many of the things are out of the current portfolio for ethical reasons, right? So if there are ethical objections to geoengineering, then it would just fall in that kind of way. So, for example, compulsory sterilization is off the table, and I think for good ethical reasons. But it's also true that other alternatives are not being actively considered for political reasons, for example, dramatic retrenchment. But it may also be true that there are strong political reasons not to consider sulfate injection, for example. So the toolkit thing doesn't quite work for me. So because of that sort of issue, I tend to think two better questions would be, first, a justificatory question: under what conditions do you think geoengineering might become justified? And secondly, and it's going to emerge as particularly important for me, the contextual question: how are those conditions relevant to the world we actually live in, or one that may plausibly emerge in the foreseeable future? Let's look a couple of answers to the justificatory question. Again, ones I'm not so keen on in these early framings. The first is the universal benefit framing. Oh, geoengineering, if we do it, it's going to benefit everybody. So just a couple of quick things. I'm not going to cover everything. I think this is sort of empirically, if you think about it, at least demanding, maybe amazing claim. If you think we're thinking about a project that's going to affect billions of individuals over hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, the claim that it's going to benefit absolutely everyone is an extraordinary claim to make, right? Moreover, there are more familiar disputes about, well, actually, there will be some winners and losers. So we've got to be careful with that universal benefit framing. But I also think there are interesting theoretical challenges, including around whether the proxies we use for benefit, right, are really good enough proxies. You move people's precipitation less than you would do under climate change. Does that mean they benefit? I don't know. I think there's a big question about that. But there are also ethical kind of worries about the requirement. One worry is it might be too strong. We might say geoengineering can be justified if it doesn't benefit absolutely everybody. If a few billionaires have to pay a few million to make it happen, or have to be taxed for that, they won't benefit. But if it does protect the basic human rights of the world's poor, maybe it's still worth considering. But it's also too weak because there are those other values. You might benefit me, right? I might agree that you benefit me if you break into my house and tidy it for me, clean it up for me, right? But that doesn't give you yet the right to do that, right? There's a pretty good, set of questions around that. So we don't get too quick into that. There's also the lesser evil framing, right, which comes in pretty quickly. I've written extensively about this, so I'm not going to belabor this one too much. I'm just going to mention the particular worry that, in a way, the lesser evil framing might make the justification too easy. Because if you imagine catastrophes as the alternative, right, and you've got pretty bad catastrophes in mind, then it actually becomes pretty easy to justify absolutely anything, really, that falls short of catastrophe, right? So just as I hope this wouldn't really be on the table, but it might be a salient kind of thing. You can imagine, well, genocidal geoengineering is better than complete catastrophe that destroys the renders the human race extinct. It's a fanciful example, but it makes a theoretical kind of point. Yeah, it would be better than catastrophe, but there might be more at stake that you want to worry about. So my conclusion from this part is just we need a more sophisticated standard for the justificatory question than universal benefit or lesser evil, and one that needs to pay attention to ethics. So quickly then on the contextual question, Right? This is the one about how are these justificatory conditions that we identify actually relevant to the world we live in, or one that might plausibly emerge. There are some basic worries here. We've already heard the worry that we're talking about technological imaginaries. We don't have these technologies yet. But there are also worries about ethical imaginaries, right? There are worries about presupposing, say, legitimate and just global and intergenerational institutions, right? If we're imagining geoengineering would be okay if we had legitimate and just global and intergenerational institutions. Right? That might be true, but it might not actually be very relevant to the problem that we face. And here, I think there's a particular issue we have to confront, that there's internal pressure on the ethical imaginaries here, and the socio-political ones. We're operating in a context of, some would say, severe political inertia, at least tracked over many decades, towards, in a sense of getting really substantive climate action. And you might worry about whether that restricts the realm of social feasibility here. You might worry in particular about what forms of SSI that, as actually implemented, are on the table given the political constraints and how attractive these are. So for example, here's a quick, fast, and loose argument, but just gives you the impression of the sort of concern I have here. So suppose you think that sulfate injection involves profound issues of political legitimacy and justice, that the most justifiable forms involve major commitments to norms of justice and community at the global level. I think that. Then ongoing political inertia on climate action, you might think, arises in large part because of deep resistance to such norms. I apologize for the typo. Therefore, the most justifiable forms of sulfate injection are not politically available. Therefore, the politically available forms of sulfate injection are likely to be ethically compromised, and perhaps severely so. Right? That will influence your reasoning. You might also add this corollary. The most justifiable forms of SSI might become politically available if there were greater political acceptance of global ethical norms. Right? That might be true. But then, presumably, if that happens, so would more robust and mitigation adaptation policies. So there's a real question about that. Most generally, I think I'm almost out of time here, you might worry from here that there's a paradoxical question that's lurking at the bottom here, which is, are we asking ourselves, what are we ethically obliged to do, given that we've not done and will continue not to do what we are ethically obliged to do? Right? Even the good news coming out of Paris looks as though it might be undershooting what we need to do. I want to end with one last salient worry here. I have a particular account of why we haven't been doing so well historically, and it involves the intergenerational worry that what I call the threat of a tyranny of the contemporary, where the current generation is willing to take short-term benefits and inflict long-term, much more severe costs on future people. If you have that kind of worry about the explanation of climate inaction in the past, you might worry that forms of geoengineering might do the same thing. Like we might be interested in forms of SSI that fix things for the short generation in the sense of holding off the worst impacts, but actually make things much worse in the future. This kind of parochial geoengineering, I think, needs to be at the center of our minds when we're thinking about moral and political requirements for geoengineering. So here's what I said. Ethics is relevant. A lot of highly salient concerns. The early framings marginalize these. They're important questions of justification, but they're also important questions of what's happening in context. Right? We don't want to presuppose an ideal moral and political context when the problem is that we've had a non-ideal moral and political context. Thank you very much.
Josh, do you have slides?
I do, yes.
Yours?
That's right. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to talk about two different subjects that aren't really terribly related, although maybe the links come out over the course of my conversation. So two parts. One is going to be on a different kind of framing than what Steve mentioned, emergency framing. And the second will pick up on some of the themes that Steve mentioned with regards to global justice and obligations to the global poor and how that might impact SRM research. So let me start with the emergency framing portion of this. We've seen some of these reports already this morning. I would say at the outset of serious discussions about geoengineering, maybe 2009, 2010, a lot of major reports and just the dialogue amongst those who researched geoengineering talked about the fact that geoengineering may be necessary in case of emergency. Maybe something that we need to pull out of our back pocket in case things go to hell in a handbasket. When the shit hits the fan, SRM is what you're going to call upon. And so these are just some examples of major reports that we've already seen that use some of that language. They are hardly unique in that regard, but it was a very common frame to use. And it's still very common. There was an ARPA-E meeting here in Washington last week, and a representative and a senator both referenced SRM in the context of an emergency framing. So it's still popular outside of our circle. So let me just start with some of the science. I'm going to critique this framing, which is not original to me, but I'll go through this. Start with the science. First of all, the big problem with this is that a climate emergency, which is what would supposedly require the use of SRM as a response measure, there's no definition for what a climate emergency is. There's a million different definitions, therefore no real definition. Typically, when commentators talk about an emergency, they have one of two things in mind. One is this sort of pretty far-fetched idea of a runaway greenhouse gas scenario where the Earth turns into Venus in the span of a century or so. May be possible over millennia, but entirely implausible over our lifetimes in the foreseeable future. So it's really not a serious concern. The more serious one is tipping points, which we have heard about already this morning. It's talked about quite a bit, and the concern would be that we would either come up to a tipping point or cross one and need to call on SRM to get us out of that mess. A lot of problems with tipping points. One of them is that conceptually, those who study tipping points most carefully, like Tim Lenton, for example, will be very quick to acknowledge that it's a very fuzzy concept. There are a lot of problems with how you define different points in a tipping element. Can you come back once you've crossed a tipping point? How close will you be to a tipping point before you would actually know you were up against one? A lot of disputes about how you define these things. I think more importantly, there's a lot of empirical doubt about whether or not there are serious tipping points on the horizon that would be nonlinear, abrupt, truly catastrophic, and likely to occur. I'll assume you all know what tipping points is. It's common parlance now, so I'll skip this sort of definitional piece, which again is from Tim Lenton, and go on to what I find to be more compelling. This is from IPCC AR5, the latest, I think, Working Group 1. This is their list of possible tipping points. And you've got sort of the rogues gallery here. You've got, ice sheet collapse, permafrost, carbon release, methane release, cleth rate methane release. Typically, a tipping point, to be considered a sort of compelling tipping point, what scientists typically mean is that you have an event that would be abrupt or nonlinear, would be irreversible, therefore incredibly high stakes, and in terms of policy, would be likely to be crossed in the foreseeable future, say the next century. And I don't know how well you can see, but not a single one of these tipping points satisfies all those criteria. And this is the scientific consensus here. This is IPCC sort of going through each of these, and each one has interesting things about it. Some are irreversible, some may or may not be abrupt, some are less likely, some are more likely, but none of them actually satisfies all those criteria. So moving on. So the consensus, as I said, as I understand it, amongst most mainstream climate scientists, is that tipping points, as they're talked about in the popular press, in movies, in Hollywood, are really implausible, or pose little risk, relatively little risk. Not totally implausible. The runaway greenhouse scenario, it pretty much is totally implausible. The very notion of a climate emergency is a socially constructed item. Mike Hume has a great quote where he says, a climate emergency is not discovered, it's made, which I think is a very useful way to think about it. If we were to go down the road of trying to frame SRM in terms of climate emergency, who defines an emergency? There is no definition, so presumably scientists would be the ones to do this. That then leads to problems of empowering scientists in a technocratic fashion that might undermine liberal norms, democratic processes, et cetera. So there are problems there, not insurmountable perhaps, but there are problems. Let me switch to the political track here. Apart from the problematic science of emergency framing, there is a long-standing debate within political theory, political philosophy, dating back to ancient Rome, believe it or not, that says that declaring emergencies or declaring a state of exception is very, very dangerous for a whole bunch of reasons. Here you have a few. It centralizes power in the hands of very few. It can involve derogations of civil and political rights. It encourages authoritarianism. It encourages hasty decision-making, which is not often appreciated. But if you're rushing to avert a catastrophe, odds are you're not going to have a sober conversation, over a conference table over a few days. You're going to rush into something, and we've got to do it now. That tends to result in pretty bad decisions. Carl Schmitt was a German political theorist in the 1920s who sort of represents the argument that it's important to be prepared to call an emergency, what he called a state of exception, because things may come to that. He had an association with the Nazi Party, which maybe should tell you something. Giorgio Agamben is a contemporary political theorist, Italian, who argues very much against framing social political problems in terms of emergencies because of these various risks that they historically have entailed. Here are a few, I've got to speed up a little bit here. Here are a few sort of highlights or lowlights of states of exceptions that have been declared historically. We have a lot of debate in France right now about the emergency law that was just imposed. 9/11, we're all familiar with the debates about torture and surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of other bad examples of what's happened when regular norms have been suspended in favor of emergency declarations. So to sum up very quickly, I think there's a weak scientific basis for approaching SRM in terms of tipping points or climate emergencies, dangerous political implications, and those add up to it being a rather unwise and unsound approach frame to use to talk about climate engineering as a routine way of talking about it. There are all alternatives. Peak shaving to reduce the worst effects is an idea of a temporary, moderate, and responsive use of geoengineering, which Doug helped to craft. We can talk about that maybe in the follow-up. There are other alternatives. Maybe one task for you guys would be to think up other ways of possible ways of implementing SRM that wouldn't fall into this emergency framing, but might resist some of those bad temptations, and I don't know what they would look like, but that could be a homework assignment for you guys. Let me quickly switch over to the other half of my talk, which is about SRM and the global poor and justice and ethics a little bit. I want to put forward a very simple argument for why justice maybe requires us to do at least research on SRM. Starting point is simply that climate change, as I imagine we would all agree, disproportionately harms the world's poor because they have the least adaptive capacity. Harms that they're going to be suffering and are suffering now and will suffer even more so in the future: heat waves, droughts, crop losses, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is pretty undisputed. Different climate policy tools have different implications for the distribution of benefits and harms among people. If you grant me the following assumptions, let me walk you through this table. Assumptions being that, say we have two time periods: the present, which goes from, say, now to 50 years from now, and the future, which goes beyond 50 years out to the remote future. We have a world of limited resources, so this is an economist's world, but it's the real world too. And the issues of distributive justice, that is to say rich versus poor, to be blunt about it, are more salient for the present generations than remote future generations in terms of our considerations, which is sort of a convention in political theory. If you grant me those, quickly you can walk through the implications of each of the major potential policy tools in terms of harms and benefits. So mitigation, which for my purposes will also include CDR, as we heard a little bit earlier, tends to impose harms on the present. 2 minutes. Harms in the present, and likely those would fall most partially on the poor rather than the rich, given all of world history we have to look at. The benefits would accrue to the future, but the fact that rather than being asked to pay for future benefits now, with current costs, it explains a lot of the reason that we don't have any major mitigation taking place. Adaptation arguably would provide benefits to the poor primarily, who have least adaptive capacity, and would impose harms in the future insofar as investing in adaptation today would, in a world of limited resources, would take away investments in mitigation, which is ultimately will solve the problem. SRM, similarly, one could argue, and I would argue, can produce benefits today that would disproportionately assist the poor as opposed to the rich, given that climate change is going to disproportionately harm the poor. If those impacts can be lessened as a result of SRM, then logic has it that poorer populations will benefit more from SRM than richer populations. The harms may be distributed in the future from SRM. If you then compare the benefits of adaptation to the benefits of SRM, you see that adaptation has generally high costs. SRM has low costs, at least in terms of direct costs, as is commonly understood. The scale of the benefits for adaptation would be local. That's the nature of it. For SRM, they would be global, if done intelligently. Therefore, with lower costs and global benefits, SRM appears, at least in principle, given my simplifying assumptions, to have a greater redistributive capacity or potential than adaptation. Furthermore, SRM addresses significant short-term risks that adaptation cannot address. SRM could address, if everything worked as according to plan, which God knows if it ever would. It could reduce the intensity of storms. It could reduce sea level rise. It could reduce crop losses that are due to crossing temperature thresholds, et cetera, et cetera. Adaptation can address some of those, but not fully and not as comprehensively as SRM could. So there are unique short-term risks that evidently only SRM would be able to address. I'll end with this one. So the moral obligation. Given that climate change, as I said, disproportionately harms today's poor, these harms, today's short-term risks, can only be reduced by adaptation and SRM, not mitigation because of the inertia in the climate system, which you've heard about. Given that SRM appears to have a greater redistributive potential in terms of its leverage, and SRM addresses a large number of very significant unique risks. I'll skip the moral hazard point. Therefore, I would argue that we have a moral obligation to research the potential of SRM to help the developing world. And I will leave it there because I'm over my time. And turn it over to Neil.
I don't. Okay. Thanks. The reason I don't have slides is because I predicted that everything I wanted to say will have been said by somebody else already, and that prediction is more or less true. So I'm sorry if this sounds like a bit of a medley of the best of today. But I'm going to focus my remarks on SRM research governance and focus on one question that Ted raised this morning, which was really the degree to which SRM research governance is an international problem or a topic for international law, and the degree to which it ought to remain in the domestic realm, and how we ought to think about that. And I think part of that for me is conceptualizing a little bit about what makes geoengineering an international problem and how that might frame how we approach SRM research governance. One starting point might be to just remind ourselves the default position in international law respecting the governance of environmental risks, which is the no harm principle. Under the no harm principle, ostensibly international law has jurisdiction where one state imposes significant transboundary harm, and so that could be on another state or that could be on the global commons. The problem in the context of SRM is using significant harm as a threshold to trigger international obligations around SRM research is going to be viewed as inadequate for several reasons, I think. but chiefly because I think it fails to address the full range of concerns that we have around SRM research, which is principally their ethical, social, and democratic implications. And so it doesn't get at the issue of the potential for SRM to contribute to something which is of clearly global common concern. And I think separating out a kind of national from an international sphere is probably not going to be a helpful default. One response that has been suggested and talked a lot about today is having an international agreement to address SRM research, and for reasons that I think have been fairly thoroughly canvassed today, that is both implausible in many instances, but probably undesirable as well. And it's undesirable, I think, because it's very hard to govern something that we don't fully understand what it is. I think the governance requires an understanding of the technological specifics. Governance probably relates to the particular technologies, and I think the governance context is going to impact how we govern it, whether it's in the oceans, whether it's in the atmosphere. And so, again, I think where we are is not thinking about this as a kind of all or nothing thing. It's not about whether we should govern it by international law or not, but really about what parts of governance we ought to allocate to the international sphere and what parts of governance we ought to allocate to the domestic sphere, at least in the short term. As a normative goal, in the short term, I think one of the most important things that we need to think about is to ensure that the research that is done, which will then be inputted into further governance discussions, is done in such a way that the research itself is considered credible and legitimate, and therefore influences those discussions. Where we don't want to be is having a discussion in 15 years about the credibility of particular research outcomes and whether we think that they're tainted or unjust in some way. And so I think we need to think about what the sort of baseline of reassurance is for responsible experimentation. And again, I think we've heard a great deal about that today in terms of low physical risk, research outcomes that aren't unduly influenced by national interests or private interests, and research that meets a sort of minimum scientific expectations for sound and credible experimentation. Most of my research has been in looking at the domestic processes around this, and largely answering the question, if you are a regulatory agency and someone like Tom Ackerman or David Keith comes forward with a particular outdoor experimental proposal, how would you deal with that particular proposal, whether you're a funding agency or whether you're a regulatory and environment agency? And there's a number of tools that we already have in domestic law that would probably be triggered, and some of our work has been looking at the adequacy of those tools and whether those tools need to be adjusted. Principally, we've been looking at environmental impact assessments and some forms of disclosure, existing forms of disclosure that exist in domestic principles. I won't talk a lot about environmental assessment. I think the big concern about environmental assessment right now is, again, it tends to use a trigger of significant environmental harm, and most experiments actually wouldn't be caught by domestic environmental assessment law. And there are, in fact, categorical exceptions in US environmental assessment law that would probably exempt most scientific research. And so thinking about I guess my encouragement to the working group is to think about governance not only on high, but also the kind of sort of micro-governance that occurs at these levels, and the changes that might have to be made at those levels to ensure that there is scrutiny, because I think that is an important role. Around disclosure, I think we actually have to understand, again, we talk about transparency, and we've seen transparency as a key value in this process, but we haven't fully thought about why we're disclosing and what the consequences of that are. Disclosure is often used as a kind of regulatory tool, so we disclose as a way because we think that sunlight is going to adjust the way people behave if they think that they're going to be scrutinized in some way, and it has a sort of risk avoidance goal, but it also has a strong legitimation goal in thinking about accountability. Again, I think most of our disclosure mechanisms do quite a good job in the first regard, and we have mechanisms such as the toxic release inventory, those kinds of things, clearinghouses. On the legitimacy side, I think our institutions domestically are not nearly as strong, and I think thinking about some of the questions that we're actually interested in and how disclosure would impact them is quite difficult. One of the other things that's come up repeatedly is around participation, and again, I think participation as a principle is fine, but when we actually think about the implementation of participation, I think it becomes very, very difficult. If we think about a particular problem that has broad global interest as a sort of common concern, we run into immediate problems about who we notify and who we consult at both the international and domestic levels. Again, I think when we look to domestic law, we actually see these problems perhaps aren't insurmountable, that there are lots of ways in which we can consult, often in a sort of representative fashion, whether it's through agencies, whether it's through NGOs, that can solve some of these problems. But again, I think some good thought from a number of the people that have been gathered in the working group on thinking about those issues probably makes some sense to me. Thinking about the role of international law, and again, I like the way Dan had broken it down in that I think we have to understand that international law can do a number of different things, and I think one of the important things that international law can do at this stage is to harmonize and adapt our domestic laws to ensure that they're integrated in some reasonable fashion. And so as research enters into the international realm, as it will in scientific debates and policy debates, that there is a sort of common current of minimum procedural and substantive issues that have been attended to in those processes. I think thinking about the way in which that could be done is likely at the start to be through soft law mechanisms, and I think again we've seen a number of good examples. I think the best example, one I would encourage the working group to look at, would be the London Protocol Oceans Assessment Framework. Before the Oceans Assessment Framework was adopted by amendment to the London Protocol, it was adopted by COP decision. It was a soft law. There were a number of resolutions around that. We should hasten to add it's an amendment to the London Protocol that has not been ratified by a single country as of today. So let's not kick up our heels too much about that. What it does, and what I think it does sensibly, is it provides a basis for countries to assess activities, principally in the high seas, but elsewhere in the marine environment that would involve marine geoengineering, but largely in the context of domestic law, and largely with a high degree of adaptability to domestic circumstances. One of the things that the London Protocol does is it uses legitimate scientific research as a kind of regulatory objective. And so in order to get a permit, you actually have to demonstrate, the actual term is that it's legitimate scientific research, and they provide a set of criteria. And the criteria is not that difficult, but it's things like demonstrating where your funding's coming from, demonstrating that your methodology has been peer-reviewed and is scientifically sound, demonstrating, interestingly, that you've looked at whether there are alternatives to outdoor experimentation that might achieve the same scientific ends. And again, I think these are all useful things at sort of the micro level that can move these kinds of discussions forward. One of the questions I think this raises is the extent to which these sort of decentralized forms of governance can actually provide for a kind of governance experimentation and learning over time. I'm done? Is that what that means? Or I can't. Done, okay. just wanted to make sure that I was completely out of time there before I continued for 30 more seconds. And so I'll just leave that as a question around experimentation, because I think it's and I think part of the answer to there is just how we think these norms are actually created. Do we actually think they come out of thin air, or do we actually think they're created in a more sort of interactive, justificatory way? And if we do think that, then these small-scale governance experiments might actually be the building blocks of larger governance as we move iteratively and onward. Thank you.
Ollie, do you have slides?
I do, yes, and I should apologise for them immediately. I wasn't planning to have slides, but it struck me that as the 20th of the speakers today and the last of the speakers today, it would be unfair on you to require you just to look at me droning on. Unfortunately, I do not typically speak with slides that say what I'm saying, and so instead I've cobbled together some slides on the fly out of the talk that I give promoting this book. That's the other reason for bringing the slides up. It allows me to put the cover of my book up and thus subliminally prime you to at some point buy this book. But the intriguing thing, intriguing for me, possibly irritating for you, is that I can't quite remember what order I put these slides in, and they don't particularly reflect the specific things that I'm saying, but they are mostly quite pretty. Now, the brief of this session is what needs to be considered in governance, and rather than trying to be encyclopedic about that, I just have noted down before coming here, and actually to some extent during the course of the day, 6 things that I think need to be considered in governance. And in order to remove any hint of suspense from the proceedings, I'm going to tell you what they are up front. One thing that needs to be considered is that we are now in the post-Paris landscape. I want to say a little bit more about that. A second thing that needs to be considered is the uncertainty, mutability, and multiplicity of that which is to be governed. It's not a simple area. Third thing, commonality with other areas of climate science and policy. Fourth area, linkage and clubs. Fifth area, precedents. And the sixth area, it might work. So, with no further ado, let us see. Yes, there we are. There's a nice transitional slide. And here's the joke. This doesn't really apply to any of the things, but I love this slide very much because it does speak to some issues of geoengineering. They say 400 years ago a squirrel could go from the Atlantic to the Mississippi without touching the ground. I dream of bringing back these days, which is why I've developed the aerial squirrel transit pod. And the point being made here, much which I will now hammer home and remove all the mirth from, is that geoengineering, that there is an issue about technological fixes that they do not necessarily fix the thing that you want to fix. They do not necessarily remediate. They do not necessarily make us whole where we are not whole. And it's important to remember that you can design a wonderful technology and yet somehow miss the point. So, Paris. I was in Paris, as were many of the other people here, and as we've been saying, it was really rather an impressive meeting. And in many ways, I'm echoing what Aaron Arber said earlier about this. But I want to stress a particular aspect of the post-Paris world, which is what you might say that we are now living more profoundly in a post-Article 2 world. Article 2 of the UNFCCC commits the parties to avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. We are clearly beyond that because we are in a world of acknowledged loss and damage, and we are in a world of specific targets and indeed negotiable targets, targets of a greater and lesser ambition and desire between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And something about that change, and particularly this idea that there's now a range of targets, and one has to some extent choose between them, distinguish between them, has put a new emphasis on the sort of geoengineering which we're not specifically talking about here today, but which I think you can't really talk about. You can't really talk about solar radiation management without talking about other forms of climate engineering. And that's carbon dioxide reduction. Carbon dioxide reduction is now much more central to the debate than it has been before for a couple of reasons to do with Paris. One is that there is no plausible I'll come back to that word. There's no plausible or possibly possible mechanism for getting to of assuring oneself of a 1.5 degree outcome that does not involve some level of negative emissions. The other thing is that large-scale negative emissions technologies do actually have a place in the text of the Paris Agreement, though not necessarily as a means of carbon dioxide reduction, but as a means of achieving net zero emissions. That's in Article 4 of the agreement. And so we now have a situation where the world is kind of talking about doing carbon dioxide reduction without talking about doing carbon dioxide reduction, because it's not talking about the modalities of reduction that might be involved. And it seems to me that at this point, that is an area where solar radiation management also needs to be discussed at some level, because we've talked in geoengineering discussions, which I've been involved with about as long as Andy. We've talked an awful lot about moral hazard, and that talk has tended to be in the context of solar radiation management. But in fact, it seems to me that at the moment we're seeing a much more pressing form of moral hazard with negative emissions, with climate dioxide reduction, because we're accepting that there is some level of this out there in the future. And so the temptation to say less mitigation now for more CDR later is ever present. And so always there is this possibility of slippage. And it is, as people have been mentioning, a risk problem. There's no right answer. But in that world, it seems to me not unreasonable to think that we will see a greater interest also in solar radiation management for exactly the reasons of the diagram that Doug showed in the first talk of the morning, where you have a complementary system of carbon dioxide reduction, solar radiation management, and mitigation, and residual suffering and adaptation. And so we are in this post-Paris world in an area where geoengineering is no longer, I think, seen as an alternative to mitigation in any major way, but there's a complex of complements, and that brings in its own sort of tricky and possibly compromising trade-offs. And here is a placeholder. This is a slide, this is a work of Turner's, which I used to illustrate the 19th century thermodynamics of aesthetics in some talks that I give, and at the moment I'm just putting up because it's pretty and swirly. And that goes with my next topic, which is uncertainty, mutability, and multiplicity of that which is to be governed. Swirl, swirl. So just look at the pretty picture. There's a phrase from Mark Twain that it's not the things that don't know which kill you, it's the things that you do know which are wrong. And I think it's a really interesting thing from the point of view of looking at the discourse on geoengineering, that you get people overstating both certainties and uncertainties in quite a big way. I just want to say at this point that there are lots of technologies out there, and the actual technologies that might be used are not necessarily the ones that you're used to talking about. So solar radiation management is not going to look like Mount Pinatubo. I think from having tracked the the discussions, I increasingly think it's unlikely that it will actually make use of sulfates. There are other forms of geoengineering that are very little discussed at the moment. Jane made brief mention of regulating cirrus, either as part of a stratospheric policy or for something else. There are regional approaches, for instance, Andy Ridgewell's rather wonderful idea of high albedo plants. That's something that we don't talk about much. There are also a large basket of potential technologies in which the total flow of energy in and out of the system is not the issue, but redistribution of energy within the system, for instance, moving energy up and down within the oceans. I mention all these things purely to say that it's a very complex set of issues, and you can't judge it as though you already know what it is. There has to be a co-production of knowledge and governance through this process. And as Jane, I think, was saying, the right approach here can actually see governance as an enabler and also as a distinguisher. One of the questions you could ask while you're working on what different technologies might you use is how governable are they? What sorts of governance might they entail? And so that sense of iteration and of reaching towards, of trying to design, of trying to reach a geoengineering which we now do not have, a geoengineering which is now purely an imaginary, that's an important part of what you must keep in mind about governance. I'm going to race through, apparently. Oh, there's a picture of the Earth. It's from it's from Michael Benson's lovely display at the London Natural History Museum. This goes with a theme of mine that I've been banging on about for some time. David Keith stopped me in my tracks a few years ago by pointing out that the system that one might need to monitor a stratospheric intervention might be on the same order of magnitude, or in fact considerably more expensive than the system that would do the intervention. This seems to me to be a very important area for governance. It's very important to try and have systems that know what's going on, not least because the governance is not necessarily of things that happen within the sovereignty of those trying to do the governing. And so and that's something which gives you a commonality with other aspects of climate science and policy. The world is, for all that we know it in wonderful detail and see it in great beauty, remarkably under-monitored in terms of actually knowing what is going on, of knowing what the aerosol makeup of the stratosphere is at the moment, these sorts of things. There's a lot of them there, and it can go on. There's the energy balance of the world. There's a recent piece by various people in Nature Climate Change saying this is something we should be monitoring very carefully. And in 2 minutes, we won't. This is one of the ways of monitoring the Earth, and it's also just a reminder, because I love reminding people, that the stratosphere is a real place. This is the view from the stratosphere over the San Francisco Bay. I may actually, at this point, more or less just go on with pictures. And there is the sort of, and there are the sort of clouds that Tom Ackerman, who is disgracefully left before he can hear me, is thinking of modifying. That's another area of commonality, because it's an area where you can imagine making experiments on clouds which are very important to climate science without reference to geoengineering and important to geoengineering. And these sort of perturbation experiments are something which the climate science community left to itself has been in fact rather loath to do in a systematic way. There's been no effort to do perturbation experiments or anything like the degree there's been an effort to compare the outputs of various different models. I think that would be a useful way forward, and I think that it's also something that it's a clear issue for sharp thinking in governance about how you can not suggest that people are false flagging, but just suggest, but actually look at ways that experiments can be designed that further both knowledge of geoengineering and knowledge of climate itself. I'm going to skip over linkage and clubs, except to say that Ted Parson should have talked about it in his own talk, because I was just going to say how clever Ted's thinking on that subject is. There's the stratosphere. And there's this. I suppose this was the thing that I thought might illustrate linkage and clubs to some point. The point is that, to some extent, being governed is a choice, and you need to be moved in, and you need to have incentives to be governed. And there's a growing literature about the introduction of clubs within the climate policy regime. And Ted has written very interestingly about the idea that one of the things about joining a climate policy, a climate club of this sort, might be that you would get, you get a greater degree of say in the involving norms of geoengineering governance. So that's time. So I'm not. that's because I thought I might need some more Turner to keep you quiet while I went on about something else. Precedents, these are Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. I have a long-running rant, which I'm not even going to try and give an encapsulation of at the moment, that nitrogen, that human intervention in the nitrogen cycle constitutes a form of geoengineering that it is possible for us to learn from when we talk about climate engineering. And in terms of governance, I just wanted to point out the entities involved in this story are spectacularly and fascinatingly diverse. They include the British Association for the Advancement of Science, BASF, the Treaty of Versailles, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and USAID. There are a lot of players who shaped the reshaping of the nitrogen cycle, and looking at that and also looking at the history of the governance or lack of it of nuclear weapons are also issues that I think are important to consider when you look at the scope of what governance of geoengineering is, because we should have no illusions about the scope. Here is one of my favorite illustrations of scope. This is looks like, at first blush, a nice naturalistic picture of the American West, of human linearity against the great unfeeling landscapes. The difference with this particular picture is that that is not the sun that is rising, that is an explosion called Plum Bob Mike, which took place over Nevada some 50 years ago, no, 60 years ago. And I put it in here simply to remind us of the consequence of the things that we're talking about. Geoengineering is a way of talking about making large-scale, purposeful interventions in the course of the planet. It's no accident that we talk about it frequently in terms linked with terms in which we talk about nuclear weapons. They are similarly consequential. And the last point I just wanted to make was we should think about the possibility that it could work. This is a piece of art by Olafur Eliasson that was shown in Tate Modern, the British Art Gallery. It was an attempt to recreate the climate in a chamber. Was potentially a rather hellish thing. It was in fact found by the British public to be a very beautiful thing. It was, people wanted it to be made, it was a temporary installation, people wanted it made permanent. People found themselves contemplating it with awe, found themselves talking about it, found themselves socializing under its light. I don't want to say that geoengineering should be seen primarily as an aesthetic project, though I think we would be foolish to deny that it has aesthetics. I just wanted to say that the governance, the essence of governance here should not be wholly focused on prohibition, wholly focused on holding back. Not holding back is wrong, on circumventing. We should think about the opportunity costs, and we should think about the possibility that if you get the co-production of technology and governance right, it is possible that this could reduce harm in quite a large way, which, as Josh said. So that's it, I think. I doubt there's another slide. There you go. There's a picture of the book. Thank you very much indeed.
I have mismanaged time sufficiently that we have 10 minutes remaining. So I suggest we take just 2 or 3 questions. We get the 2 or 3 questions from the floor. We allow brief responses, and then we continue the conversation over in the Arts Center. So I see Ted, I see Holly, and Steve. Let's take those 3 comments.
I've got a question to Josh on your second argument, your moral imperative argument. It strikes me that you weren't bold enough about the implications of that argument, because if we assume that the consequences of climate engineering research... Do I need to start over? No, okay. If we assume that... If we assume that the consequences of research are to elaborate knowledge of a set of ways that roughly replicate current projections about regional and seasonal distributions of effects, then it seems to me that the moral imperative to pursue climate engineering on behalf of reduction of harm to the world's poorest and most vulnerable people applies not only to the research, but may well apply in a future decision regarding deployment. And so there may be a compelling moral argument based upon relief of suffering and deprivation of the world's poorest people to do it. I think the implications of your claim are thus much more provocative and profound than than you took credit for. And I think these need to be faced explicitly. I mean, there have been remarks periodically through the day. There's kind of, I mean, have you noticed there's an undercurrent of sort of some tension, some conflict and debate here about the implications of equity claims regarding governance of climate engineering. And here and there we hear sort of bits of empirical argument crop up. I think the equity claims depend upon empirical claims about the expectation of distribution of consequences from available intervention opportunities as facilitated by research. And I think it's important to be explicit and careful about those. And under certain assumptions, such as I think you laid out quite compellingly, the equity claims, the justice claims could cut in precisely the contrary direction than much of the sort of early political discourse among the privileged, lucky, rich people like us who have the luck of being involved in this have suggested. So do you want to take this on? And you can or not, but
I'll say a little bit about it.
Well, let's hold off. Let me just bring in these other two questions, and then we'll invite some final comments. So Holly and then Steve.
I think Pablo has raised his hand as well.
Thanks, Josh. This is also a comment kind of in between your 2 points. It seemed like the climate emergency framing was squarely placing it within climate in terms of tipping points and runaway emissions, but it strikes me that the emergency would really be most likely food scarcity, water scarcity, and then, energy triple crisis, all of those factors linked. And I was wondering if somebody looking at the world today, from an alien or fresh eyes perspective, would see the emergency right now for millions or even billions of people on the planet. And would that change how we think about it if the emergency is already here and present? And it also seems like the governance for, a massive food crisis or a massive water scarcity crisis would be happening at the same time as any climate engineering governance. So I wonder how those might end up being linked and what it might mean. I guess I'm curious if the working group will comment on that. Thanks.
Thanks. And Steve.
Yeah, my question's for Josh. Josh, I heartily agree with you that if you want to save lives and property in the next few decades at least, your options are basically adaptation and SRM. But I'm not convinced by your argument that SRM is superior to adaptation. It seems to me that SRM will leave existing climatic damages unchecked. And as I said earlier today, quoting Mike Hume, climate's always been dangerous. Climate is causing huge losses of lives and property today. Whereas adaptation, if we break it away from this notion that it's simply a cost of failed mitigation and adapt properly to climatic variability, has the possibility of actually improving rather than leaving the status quo with respect to the condition of the poor. And in that case, not only would that be an increased benefit in itself, but would also potentially give them the possibilities for greater economic growth and development, which would far outweigh the superiority of SRM. So this isn't an argument against doing SRM research, but I do remain to be convinced by your claim that SRM is superior and has more of an ethical imperative than adaptation to climate variability.
Let me come to Pablo as we come back up to the panel for final thoughts.
Thank you. And first of all, big thanks to all of you doing SRM for trying to bring the voices from the South, from humanitarian sector. It's magnificent. And it's not enough, and it's hard to show up. Thank you. It is phenomenally scary. It's unimaginably scary for some of us to hear what I think is a very valid and very genuinely heartfelt, motivated by solidarity argument that it may be our necessity to go help the poor by doing this. It's exactly the breaking into someone's house to make it tidy. What is really concerning is the ability of those who may want to deploy SRM to do it on behalf of those who don't even know this is happening. I know that we're all trying to bring those voices in. We're failing for very understandable reasons. Let's please think about how to create the incentives for those guys to show up. I am good friends with two of the people who are behind pushing the 1.5. One a scientist from the Pacific Island, another one a community organizer from Bangladesh. They were not trying to bring geoengineering into this. 1.5 was a sense of restoring a sense of dignity for those who were marginalized. So if we're going to bring geoengineering as a solution, it's going to accelerate marginalization. I'm not saying that, okay, avoiding marginalization but let them die underwater is best. But we have a long way forward to bring those voices that are missing. And I hope that the working group thinks of how to create the incentives for those guys to show up before it's that emergency and the time to start deploying. Thank you.
Very brief final comments from the panel. If anybody has anything to say.
Should I start since I was the...
Please.
Very, very quickly, starting with public, yes, I agree that we are making proposals on behalf of billions of people who have no idea what this is, let alone whether it would be a good thing. So I think there is every need to expand the conversation. That's a cliche, I suppose, but it's true. Andy's certainly trying it. We have our own work in the Philippines, which you are familiar with, trying to really get much deeper involvement for people who live in the developing world in deciding what ought to be researched, what ought not to be researched. Steve, on your point about SRM versus adaptation, maybe it came across this way, but I wasn't arguing that SRM was morally superior or a superior period to adaptation. I think both need to be done because they address different kinds of risks. I think my point was that given that the potential benefits of SRM are global in scope, whereas the real benefits of adaptation are local in scope by definition, that in a world of limited resources, if you only have so much cash to float around, you can get more bang for your buck, theoretically, by investing in some amount of SRM, but I wouldn't advocate doing that to the exclusion of adaptation. I just think it's compelling in its own terms in a way that adaptation is not, but adaptation also addresses risks that SRM could never address. So it goes both ways. Holly, I think your comment is just good for the group to have heard, so I won't really address it, but it's a compelling comment to make. Ted, back to your point. Yes, what's implicit in what I'm arguing is that if research showed that what I proposed or laid out is in fact true, then there would be a very powerful argument, moral argument, for actually deploying. That's clearly the implication. I'm a cautious guy, so I would tend not to sort of run out and be that bold in this kind of a presentation, but without question, that is buried within, not so difficult to see, not so deeply, within what I argued, and I think if all the evidence right now, most of the evidence points towards the way I portrayed SRM, that being an accurate portrayal in terms of the benefits and risks and costs, short-term, long-term. If that were solidified by a hell of a lot more research, I would absolutely support deployment. So,
Steve.
Yeah. So first thing, I think it's a good thing to raise an overtly moral argument, right, and put it up for assessment, right? I think that actually it is the kind of thing you need to respond to the justificatory question. But I also think you need to you need to defend it in that context, and you also need to defend it against my contextual question. And I have some concerns there already, right? Because you might say, for example, well, first, there are other values on the table. Pablo already mentioned there are questions about do you have the right to do it even if it benefits people, right? And given the history of the relationship between the people in the rich countries who are likely to be developing this research and implementing it and the people in the less developed countries that have the world's biggest concentration of poor people, it's unlikely that that's just a slam dunk, right, that you can deal with that. Second sort of issue is that it's wonderful to suddenly generate this big concern for alleviating global poverty, right? But we know that concern has been with us for a while, and a lot of people have raised it and proposed lots of things, but not much has actually happened. It's deeply linked to vulnerability that these people are poor, and that's deeply linked to they live in a situation, many of them, of injustice and political illegitimacy and so on. And it's linked to that so part of their situation rests on a resistance to justice, legitimacy, and other important values. So given all that, the contextual question becomes really interesting, right? I don't think you can just announce we're going to do this and our goal is to benefit the global poor and think that that automatically is going to mean that sulfate injection, you know, emerges of the form of sulfate injection, say, that emerges is the one that actually best protects the global poor. And a couple of things, last point, a couple of things that concerned me, at least how it seemed that Josh was presenting it in the talk, and he's responded a little differently here, so I don't know. He did seem to suggest to me two things. One was that he expected SRM to replace at least some extent of adaptation, some level of adaptation. I think it was because of a budget constraint, but anyway. And the second thing was that he expected in one of the diagrams that it would impose increased harms on future generations. And those two things give me great pause given my overall analysis of what the sort of problem that climate change is a perfect moral storm and a tyranny of the contemporary. So I would say it's good to open the moral argument, but I don't think this is a slam dunk, especially given the contextual thing. Thank you.
I am going to have to call things to a close.
Can I just come in very briefly on an assumption that's been widely made?
Yes.
I think is something of the tyranny of the contemporary. That's an abiding assumption that it would be developed countries that would be most likely to move towards deployment, and I think that's an entirely unjustifiable assumption. Developed countries have shown themselves entirely willing not to act on climate change in many different ways. They have very good adaptive capability. The ability to do some sorts of geoengineering are not necessarily particularly technologically challenging. I don't think that you need to have the world's greatest research labs to do it all. And I think the assumption that in 2030, 2040, 2050, this is going to be something that's going to be an issue for developed countries rather than developing countries is entirely implausible.
I'm going to make just one point because this came up in several of the discussions about are we doing too much governance and too little science. 5 years ago when SRMGI was being done, I remember, I'm forgetting who wrote that paper, but there was a paper which listed the spike in scientific articles. And I remember at that time, the conversation in the room was, hang on, there's suddenly a lot of science going on. We need to do some governance. And now I guess the working group, which is kind of coming into this world, suddenly thinks there's a lot of governance going on and very little science. So I think this is going to be cyclical, and it's going to, we are going to play tag one way or the other. It's better to avoid this kind of what I would call a false competition between governance and climate engineering science.
Ed?
On this precise point, I've been told in conversations I spoke too much in code in my remarks from the panel this morning when I said it's virtually inevitable that there will, within a few decades, be serious proposals to undertake operational scale use of some of these technologies, and it will come from a surprising set of actors. What I meant but didn't say clearly is that my judgment is that it most likely will be proposals brought forward by governments of developing countries in unexpected and broader and kind of cut across normal categories partnerships. So I just want to endorse and thank the last two comments, both of which brought this out explicitly, and say it's been an unstated theme, and it calls into question some of the moral questions as well, because do the industrialized countries want to be in a position 30 years from now from saying, no, developing countries, you may not do this, and we will stop you?
On that note. So Mark reminded us through the day that we spent a significant amount of carbon as a group to gather. We've also spent a significant amount of time, your time, in being together in the room today. I hope it's been valuable. It's been extraordinarily valuable for me, and I guess that's what matters. And hopefully valuable for the working group as we begin our work tomorrow. Right now we're moving to a reception where these conversations will continue. To get to the reception, you need to go up the stairs at the main doors there, and across the quad in that direction, and then across the street, and you'll see the Art Center. There'll be people to guide you across there. The bus back to the hotel, for those of you staying at the hotel, will leave at 7:30, I think I discussed with Taiba. So that gives you a little time in the reception room. And for those of you convening for dinner tonight, dinner will start at about 8:15, 8:30. If you haven't talked with Michael yet about dinner, then please do so. My thanks to the final panel, and my thanks to all of you for being here today.